Hello, Bronwyn. Thank you for joining us for this talk.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. It's been 25 years now since the UNDP's Human Development Report has highlighted the issue of human security and broadened the understanding of the security and development nexus. Do you think the current policy framework addressing this nexus is adapted to the current context, or do you think there are new trends that policymakers should be taking into account?
Well, I have to say my own perception, and it's a perception based on the fact that I sit in Washington, is that the idea of security and development has largely fallen by the wayside in the United States. And of course, that's important because the U.S. is driving so many of the military interventions on the continent, and so much of the development agenda even through its foreign aid budget. We, I think, have gotten to the stage where we no longer talk about strategies that were very important a decade ago, like counterinsurgency strategy or even counter-radicalization, which were ways of dealing with U.S. security issues that were very centered on improving the lot of local populations. Counterinsurgency strategy, for example, held that you had to win hearts and minds, that it was important for people to feel secure, that police brutality was something that increased the likelihood of recruitment into extremist groups. And those kind of holistic approaches to the security issues that we're confronting, I think are less and less on the table. And we seem to be focused more and more on a kind of what's commonly described as a whack-a-mole approach, where we're really using drone strikes and kinetic strikes to deal with individuals that we consider dangerous, while the development agenda is sort of pushed into the background. And in particular, in the Trump administration, that's accompanied by an effort to reduce the amount of foreign aid dramatically, to reduce the budget of diplomats dramatically. And so I think on the U.S. side, there's been a very determined sort of stepping away from the idea of the security and development network nexus. And I think it's a very disturbing and distressing development.
So, you mentioned now the strategy for U.S. intervention, and
well, we can call it a strategy for intervention. That may be overly kind.
Okay, and don't you think that there is now a disconnect, since you mentioned the drone strikes, between the security components and the development one? They don't go side by side anymore.
No, they very, very much on the contrary. They don't go side by side. And in fact, one of the major problems with relying so heavily on drone strikes to achieve security objectives is that they're tremendously destabilizing. In places like Somalia, where there have been hundreds of drone strikes this year, we have a phenomenon now where you see things like, they actually call them airstrike refugees, people who've been driven from villages by the tempo of the airstrikes, and people who've lost family members and feel that they need to flee because they don't feel safe, because they're surrounded by people that the United States considers terrorists, and so they feel that they have to leave. And obviously, you can't have development in a situation where people are forced to flee from their homes. But increasingly, that is the situation. And the U.S. seems to be constantly scaling up the tempo of these strikes, not only in Somalia, but in the Sahel. So I think, again, we're really back to this. They say everything is circular, of course. I think we're almost back to this sort of pre-2010 approach to security, where it's really all about striking high-value targets, and even, frankly, in places like Somalia, not even high-value targets, but anyone who can be identified as a member of al-Shabaab or a member of a terrorist group, even if they're extremely young, even if they've been forcibly conscripted, even if they couldn't find America on a map. Unfortunately, it's a really militaristic approach to trying to solve a very, very complex set of problems, and not only in Somalia, but in many parts of Africa.
So do you think policymakers should be including grassroots organizations so that they can adapt to the real needs of the population?
My honest feeling is that there's not a lot of effort to really engage the public. Particularly in the Horn of Africa, the U.S. has always preferred to work through proxies, whether it's Ugandan and Ethiopian forces in the African Union, or whether it's the Somali government. The U.S. likes to present itself as having what we call a light footprint, which is that we're pulling the strings, but we don't like to look like we're present. That is changing a little bit with these airstrikes, which I think are being more and more directly attributed to the United States. Somalis have a long experience in Mogadishu with airstrikes. I think outside of the country, it's harder for them to really identify what they are and who's perpetrating them. But increasingly, I think that they are associated with the U.S. And as that happens, it's going to be harder and harder for the U.S. to pretend that we're not active combatants in this conflict.
So do you think the light footprint kind of approach is motivated by past intervention, the history of probably failed intervention?
It is. It is. I think that the U.S., particularly in the Somali context, where the United States and Washington is haunted by what happened with Black Hawk Down, that the military really fears a backlash and thinks, in my view, thinks misguidedly that it's better to intervene through other forces like the Ethiopian army. That has presented its own set of problems in the past and created its own nasty legacy. But I think that the U.S. is feeling short of good options in Somalia at the moment.
There is a growing discussion on a triple nexus, adding environmental aspects, especially that you're discussing now the Horn of Africa. It's a region where the environment has an important impact on the security of the region. How do you think the U.S. strategy is adapting to this situation?
I very much to my regret, I feel that the U.S. is far behind on climate change. And it's been my observation, again, sitting in policy conversations in Washington, that we don't typically include the environment as much as we should. The climate crisis is here already in places like California and places like the Horn of Africa. And there's a new normal that consists of a lot of instability and a lot of hunger and a lot of disruption and a lot of displacement. And in contexts like Somalia, which is very distant to us and which has always included a lot of instability, I think it's harder to tease out the impact of climate change from a policy-making perspective. But the reality is that more and more people are going to be forced out of their homes. Somalia is perennially afflicted by drought. It's a regular occurrence, but they're becoming more severe and more prolonged. And as that happens, of course, conflict becomes more and more rampant. And I don't think, again, that there's a good strategy. I mean, obviously, in this conference that we're attending, we've spent a lot of time talking about approaches to climate change. And there are a lot of iron bullets that are being fired at it, but clearly there's no really good method for increasing the amount of resources available to people, particularly in contexts like Somalia. And in Somalia, it's especially worrying because, as it is, about 50% of the food supply is imported as humanitarian relief already, which means that there's, I think, not a lot of capability for scaling up. And I think that there's already such a large amount of aid going to Somalia that it's a very hard ask to go back to policymakers and say, can you increase it still further, particularly when it's coupled with the kind of exhaustion that donors are feeling. So I consider it extremely concerning and worrying.
There is now a move towards trade rather than aid. How do you think that it's feasible in areas where the security is still a predominant issue?
I mean, this is the problem, of course. We talk about a security and development network nexus, but more often security is undermining development, or lack of development is undermining security. And definitely in places like Somalia, when you talk about trade, it's often extractive. People are coming in and stealing fish, or they're coming in and they're trying to obtain concessions for oil. And there are some nations, of course, Saudi Arabia, for example, that has a long-term trading relationship with the country. But for the most part, you're certainly not seeing the entrance of American businesses to that environment. There are a lot of Somali diaspora who are trying to come back to the country, but I think even that movement is under strain because we haven't seen the kind of progress politically that we had hoped to see. And again, I think people are questioning the wisdom of making investments in Mogadishu at this time.